In this unit, we'll be discussing the Neolithic Revolution, and we'll begin by challenging some of the assumptions that people had previously made about the invention of agriculture. Some of the key terms that we're going to discuss is the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, and Neolithic cultures. Let's begin with the myths. Let's move to the next slide. Historically, the model went kind of like this. People had assumed that once farming was invented, then people began to settle. They began to settle in one place and create their villages. In fact, it's the other way around. So myth number one we want to tackle here is that farming was invented and then people settled. What we know is people had already settled before the invention of agriculture. So let's go through, or at least go back to the Paleolithic cultures and take a look at the way that they structured themselves and how they lived. So they lived in small groups. We call these groups bands. And generally speaking, probably about 20 to 50 individuals maximum. Now, these small groups, they didn't exist within a stratified society. So thinking about a stratified society, this is the type of society that we live in today, where we rank individuals, unfortunately. They lived in a society that was egalitarian. Everyone was equal. In addition to being in small groups and having this egalitarian structure, people were nomadic. In other words, they were constantly moving. They didn't have permanent settlements. So they had temporary camps during the Paleolithic. The reason why they had temporary camps was they were following game. They were following the resources as they moved from place to place. By and large, these individuals, they would have utilized local foodstuffs, the vegetation, seasonal vegetation, something that we refer to as subsistence foraging. In contrast, as we move into the Mesolithic or the Middle Stone Age, this is where we start to see some changes. Here's where we start to see individuals beginning to settle. Now, this is before the invention of agriculture. What they've done is they've started to settle in areas where grains have started to become abundant or where they're beginning to flourish. And here, focus on that word. We're going to come back to it, that these grains are beginning to flourish. There's environmental change that's taking place that's allowing more growth of grains, and we begin to utilize not only the grains and the pistachios and the lentils, for example, the Enkenhorn, but we also start to rely upon the animals that are also using some of those resources as well. So we don't need to travel as far. The other thing that's happened is some of the animals that we had traditionally hunted during the Old Stone Age or the Paleolithic, they've also starting to move into or can be characterized by extinction. They're starting to become less available. So we're shifting our focus from a lot of meat supplemented by vegetation and fruit, and we're starting to incorporate more vegetation and fruit into our diet and probably smaller animals as well. Let's move on to the next slide. It's also a myth that the adoption of farming led to better health. This is something that we have taken for granted. We thought, well, of course, when we invented farming, we had more food available to us. And that's not accurate. That's not what the archaeological evidence supports. So if we go to the Paleolithic, we look at the cultures, and again, here's a great time that we can compare and contrast what's taking place over time as we're shifting from the Paleolithic to the Mesolithic and the Neolithic. In the Paleolithic, we see that people experienced very few diseases. It doesn't mean that disease wasn't around. It certainly was. However, the diseases that started to become prominent during the Neolithic period and the ones that we experience today, for example, influenza, the common cold, historically smallpox and measles, that stuff didn't exist during the Paleolithic. That's a product, again, of human behavior and some of the changes that we caused in our own ecological system that we were creating. So, as pointed out, the archaeological record here, when we look at Paleolithic peoples, it supports that they did have very good health. Like I said, it doesn't mean that they didn't get sick. They did. They got injured. All of that stuff happened. But there was a very different type of disease or illnesses that these individuals experienced. During the Neolithic, the archaeological record provides us with a very different understanding of the types of diseases that these people experienced. So during the Neolithic, we have what's referred to as the first epidemiological transition. It's a big word, I know, it's a big concept, but simply it means that infectious disease becomes the major killer or the major source of disease for humankind at that point of time. The Neolithic saw the birth of agriculture. Not only the birth of agriculture, it saw humans domesticating animals for the very first time. We're keeping animals, and now we're starting to live in larger civilizations. More people, animals, hygiene issues, all of this starts to create a situation that makes infectious disease a problem that we need to grapple with, and we still grapple with it to this very day. In addition to the first epidemiological transition, and we'll talk more about some of those diseases later on, we also see a good amount of evidence for malnutrition. And this is kind of ironic. You know, we think, aren't they growing their food? Aren't they keeping animals? Why are we seeing malnutrition? Well, this is also related to the type of changes that are taking place within the society itself. They're starting to become ranked. And producing food, especially in the early stages of agriculture, it didn't have the yield that we have today. For example, I have a small garden in my backyard that I've started to grow, and that requires a lot of attention just to produce lettuce, for example, and tomatoes for a family of 4. New occupational injuries, they also emerged. So in the Paleolithic, the type of occupational injuries that people would have been with respect to hunting, perhaps a clash with a different clan, tripping, falling within that type of nomadic lifestyle. Now we're looking at occupational injuries that are related to repetitive work. So we start to see issues in the knees, we start to see issues in the hips and in the shoulders, people engaging in that repetitive work. And as pointed out, a lot of this is related to social inequality. So for the very first time, and we had pointed out the Paleolithic, those cultures, they were egalitarian. Now a ranked society has emerged. We have a society that's now based upon social inequality, and that's never disappeared. So if you're looking for the roots of social inequality, for example, you have to go back to the invention of agriculture. Let's move on to the next slide. It's also a myth that farming led to decreased labor. When we look at Paleolithic cultures, and we've looked at traditional hunting and gathering cultures, now while they're not living fossils, they do give us some insight into the amount of work that's necessary to live as a forager, as a hunter and gatherer. And what we see is they do have limited time spent gathering resources. In fact, if we look at a group of people in the Kalahari Desert that had been traditionally studied by Richard Lee, for example, at the University of Toronto, the Kung, sorry if that was a little bit loud, that exclamation mark is a click, and these people sometimes they refer to as speaking in click language. They spend approximately 20 hours per week foraging. In contrast, we're 44, 46 hours, if not more. What we see take place during the Neolithic is a drastic change in the amount of time that one needs to dedicate to food production. So the Neolithic, people engage in constant work maintaining those crops, not only the crops, but they need to maintain the animals. In an effort to do this, we also have new divisions of labor. That's starting to emerge. So we have our stratified society. That's emerged. We have individuals who are ranked as more important than others. And this also coincides with labor as well. Some labor is deemed as more important. other labor is deemed as less important, and people use that to begin to rank society. In fact, this is where we start to see the emergence of a caste system, where people are ranked based upon the occupational category that they're born into. Let's move on to the next slide. It's also a myth that farming resulted in the availability of more calories. If we go back to Paleolithic type cultures, or at least here we'll say hunting and gathering cultures that may be representative of people in the Paleolithic, I'm being careful there. We want to say that generally speaking, there are ample resources. This doesn't mean that they don't have periods where they experience famine. That wouldn't be realistic. It would be naive to say that they always had food available. But generally speaking, if we look at models, for example, let's go to the Kung, we see that they have 2,200 calories per day, at least as recorded by Richard Lee. And that's in the Kalahari Desert. They have access to approximately 8 to 9 ounces of meat. They have over 200 varieties of plants and nuts, lots of nuts, the mangogo nut that they utilize, a lot of calories available to them. In the Neolithic, we don't see the same access to resources. What we do see, at least according to archaeological evidence, is a decrease in caloric intake. And that's kind of ironic. We're thinking, why? Isn't more food available? Well, if we start to put this puzzle together, we also have to consider that we have a ranked society. They're in the early stages of agriculture. They're learning how to grow their food. But the other component is when we look at, for example, a peach or a watermelon or maize, we see the bulking varieties that we have today. If we think about what was available during the Neolithic and the Paleolithic, a watermelon certainly was nowhere near the size that it is today. Corn nowhere near the size that it was today. So not only did you need to produce a lot of this stuff, but you'd also need to eat a lot of it as well. So a lot of work, and the caloric payoff is fairly low. Some of the research or the evidence that supports this, for example, Jared Diamond in a famous paper I'll come to next, he illustrates that the stature of people prior to the Neolithic, people were taller. As we progressed into the Neolithic and on into time as we got closer to modern times, people in fact got shorter. Only recently are we beginning to get to those pre-Neolithic heights, 6 feet for the average male. On average, we're looking at probably 500 calories a day. Looking at the caloric intake here, we can look at that from modern times as well. I think it's always nice to reflect on where we are. 2,200 calories a day, living in a vigorous and active lifestyle. That's enough calories to maintain body weight. Health Canada suggests that we consume more than that. And I live a fairly vigorous and active lifestyle. I run, and between running and walking, I'm hitting about 14K a day. That's what the Paleolithic people were doing. I'd say that's pretty vigorous and active. A lot of people don't get in that much exercise. And if they're intaking 2,600 calories a day, that's why we're seeing increased body weight over time. We'll talk a little bit about that later on, though. Jared Diamond, as pointed out, he took a look at the Neolithic Revolution in a paper in Discovery magazine in the mid-1980s. And he came out with this statement. He said, farming was mankind's greatest mistake. And that was a mind-blowing idea at the time, because a lot of these myths, they hadn't gone challenged. They were unchallenged myths, and we didn't know a whole lot about it. As pointed out, Jared Diamond, he took a look at the stature of individuals. Pre-Neolithic, much taller, on average 6 feet. After the Neolithic Revolution, males dropped on average to about 5'6", females to 5'2". What's going on? Why are we seeing shorter individuals? And the only conclusion was, again, availability of resources and calories. In addition, and while Jared Diamond wasn't talking about inequality, if we reflect on the statement, farming was mankind's greatest mistake. And as I pointed out, if you're looking for the roots of social inequality, if you're looking for the roots of sexism, if you're looking for the roots of racism, we're going to find it with the emergence of farming. Again, I think there's a little bit of hyperbole here or extreme exaggeration on Jared Diamond's part. From another perspective, I'm going to tell you that if we didn't adopt agriculture, we certainly wouldn't be here today. It was a necessary adaptation if we were going to progress forward as a group of humans. That's where we'll leave it right now. We'll pick up shortly with our next segment in this unit. Have a great day.